بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with al-Muhadhab min Ihya Ulumuddin by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh. And as has been mentioned various times, the Muhadhab is Sheikh Salih al-Shami. And we, prior to Ramadan, we stopped at the Asrar al-Salah, and we said that we will look at the Siyam in preparation for Ramadan. But inshallah, so going back to the Salah now, and just to recap kind of what we covered in brief. So we reached about al-Bab al-Thalith, al-Shurut al-Batira min A'mal al-Qalb. So we reached the section wherein we're talking about the conditions for having a living heart during the prayer, i.e. a living prayer. And so he says, المعاني التي بها حياة الصلاة اعلم أن هذه المعاني تكثر العبارات عنها ولكن يجمعها ست جمل هي. So he says that the people speak about this often basically. How is it that you can have a salah which is alive, which has meaning, which has purpose? How can you attach yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the salah? How can you benefit from your prayer, etc.? And he says that many people speak about that which gives meaning to the salah in various ways. تكثر العبارات عنها. But he says ولكن يجمعها ست جمل. There are six statements that bring everything that has been mentioned by those that came before Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala together. Because Imam al-Ghazali, the Ihya Ulumuddin, is basically a compilation of the works and the concepts of the ulama of suluk that came before him. So the purpose behind Ihya was to bring together everything that was written on literally the topic of Ihya al-Ulum into one source. And so he's saying, if you read about this, you're going to find various statements, you're going to find various discussions, various formulations, but they all come down to six things. Number one, hudur al-qalb, so the presence of the heart. Number two, at-tafahum, to comprehend, to understand, i.e. comprehension of what's being recited, etc. And number three, at-ta'zeem, so to glorify and to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the station that he deserves of ta'zeem. Number four, al-hayba, so to have awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to a degree, and the lack of a better word is due to my lack of language. Wal-haya, wal-raja, hope, so to have hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wal-haya, to have a feeling of shyness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says that basically we're going to mention the details and so on and so forth, and we already covered. So he says, فحضور القلب ونعني به أن يفرغ القلب من غير ما هو ملابس له ومتكلم به. So he says that حضور القلب, the presence of the heart, is for one's heart to be present in the salah, free of anything else. So there is no distraction, no conversation taking place in the person's heart. His heart is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and focused on the function behind the salah, which is sila, to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc., etc. Then he says, والتفهم لمعنى الكلام, so أمر وراء حضور القلب. So he says to understand what the meanings intended behind the words are, i.e. kalamullah, the azkar that we go through in the salah, etc. And he says, and this is something which is behind the presence of the heart. Meaning, if you understand the words, then this pushes your heart into being present. And we spoke about the advantage that those who understand Arabic have over those who do not understand Arabic. We spoke about the advantage of Arabic speakers and those who study Arabic. And so you have various levels of understanding Arabic. You have those that casually speak Arabic. It's their first language, their mother language, their mother tongue. And then you have those that have studied the Arabic language, i.e. they've studied the classical Arabic language. They've studied grammar, they've studied sarf, they've studied, all of these things, al-nahu, al-sarf, al-urud, and so on and so forth. They have an advantage over even the Arab speakers for which Arabic is their mother tongue. Why? Because many Arab speakers, they don't actually understand the grammar, the sarf. They don't understand these things, balagha. And so when they hear the Quran, yeah, they can still be reminded, but it's a surface level reminder. The deeper someone goes into the Arabic language, the deeper and more profound the meanings of the Quran become. And that's why they say that at tafsir, to author a tafsir, a person has to be, to actually author an original book in tafsir, a person has to reach a level of mastery in all of the foundational sciences of Islam. It's not possible unless a person reaches mastery in the foundational sciences of Islam. And so one of the only ulama considered to be an alim who has contributed something original in tafsir is al-Tabari, rahimahullah ta'ala. Why? Because he was an alim in everything else. And of course, the most important thing, the language. And just on that point, we have to really reflect over our states in the UK and in Europe when it comes to the Arabic language. How many generations of Muslims do we have in the UK and in Europe? And why is Arabic not yet considered to be a second language? We have to work towards developing Arabic into being a second language. When someone becomes Muslim, they learn the Arabic language, especially if they're a young person. And why not? That was what happened. Wherever Islam entered, Arabic became a language which was practiced and spoken amongst the people. And that's why if you look to, if you go to any place in Africa where Islam has been there for a long time, any place in the subcontinent where Islam has been there for a long time, you will find what Arabic is spoken. Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, even Eastern Europe. So that which is considered to be Eastern Europe anyway, places like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on and so forth. Those places, they speak Arabic there. The older generation passed down Arabic, even if it's only the scholar class. Arabic is a mainstay in the country. They don't have to leave the country in order to learn Arabic. So likewise here in the UK, it's something we have to consider. And in Europe, if we want Islam to be preserved, the best way to preserve Islam is to preserve the language of Islam, which is Arabic. And if you preserve the language of Islam, and the language of Islam is passed on to the generations that come, then no one can meddle and dabble in the deen. Why? Because the generation that you give the Arabic language to, they have a direct link and a direct door to the Quran, to the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, to the classical works of the ulama, the fuqaha, and so there's no playing with the deen. Whereas if you leave them and you don't give them the Arabic language, even if they memorize the Quran, they can still be played with. They're still subject to whoever's interpreting the Quran for them, translating the Quran for them. And so we have to think about the Arabic language for ourselves and within society. And then he says, وَالتَّعْظِيمُ أَمْرٌ وَرَاءَ حُضُورِ الْقَلْبِ وَالْفَهْمِ زَائِدٌ عَلَيْهِمَا. So we're not going to go into the details, but basically, just as at-tafahum is something which drives a person's heart into being present, ta'zeem of Allah drives a person into the tafahum. Many people, why do they get into seeking knowledge? Because they want to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They glorify Allah. They want to glorify Allah. They see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way that he should be seen to a degree. Of course, you can never see Allah the way he should be seen in this life, but to a degree, and a person wants to know more, wants to learn more, and it pushes him or her. And then he says, وَالْهَيْبَةُ زَائِدَةٌ عَلَى التَّعْظِيمِ. So likewise, hayba, which is basically to be in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something which is extra. It's extra on top of the ta'zeem, the tafahum, etc., etc. And then he says, وَالرَّجَاء, so hope, وَالْحَيَاء. And we're going to kind of cover all of these things again anyway, briefly. So I'll just get to where we got to, inshallah, where we were speaking about the asbab, the means of acquiring these things. And so I'll go to where we reached. He says, وَأَمَّا الْهَيْبَةُ وَالْخَوْفُ فَحَالَةٌ لِلنَّفْسِ تَتَوَلَّدُ مِنَ الْمَعْرِفَةِ بِقُدْرَةِ اللَّهِ وَسَطْوَتِهِ. So he says, as for hayba and khawf, how can a person acquire hayba and khawf? How is it that I can acquire an awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When I stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I stand with awe. When I think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think with awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how can I acquire that? And al-khawf is literally fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how do I acquire these two qualities? He says, فَحَالَةٌ لِلنَّفْسِ تَتَوَلَّدُ مِنَ الْمَعْرِفَةِ بِقُدْرَةِ اللَّهِ وَسَطْوَتِهِ. So these two are a state of being which is born from a person having knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ability, number one, and number two, the extent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's domain, or the extent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's control, reign, etc. Which is basically what? Everything. Al-alam is what? Rabbul alameen is what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Lord of everything that is not Him, basically. Which is everything other than Allah. Everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belongs to Allah. As in, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not created, but everything else is created. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, authority, reign, domain, dominion extends to everything and anything. Nothing is free of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's where the dhikr comes from, that we should be saying before we sleep. And if you really understand the meaning of it, it's amazing. لا ملجأ ولا منجأ من الله إلا إليه. لا ملجأ ولا منجأ من الله إلا إليه. That there is no escape, nor is there any protection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except through who? Through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do you seek protection from Allah's punishment? Through Allah's mercy. How do you seek protection? Through that which we perceive to be bad qadar. Through Allah's what? Good qadar. And so on and so forth. And so nothing escapes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing. And so when a person knows that, what happens? They'll become munkasirul qalb. As Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he said earlier, i.e. for us a few weeks ago now, that a person will become broken in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that Allah is in control of his affairs, all of them. And so a person will be worried. If I sin here, what's going to happen? What's the consequence of my sin? If I sin, I might lose out in my health, in my wealth, in knowledge. And the ulama, they say, the worst punishment that can afflict a person in this life, what do you think it is? The worst punishment, other than kufr. Huh? Jahl, but jahl is born from something. Huh? And arrogance is born from something. Lack of knowledge, born from something. So, you can have a scientist of the heavens, of the skies, and they're studying the stars, the planets, etc., all night, all day, enthusiastic, passionate. But you speak to them about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they say there's no creator. Where does that come from? Huh? Yeah, and the misguidance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what? Blindness is not blindness of the eyes, but it's what? Blindness of the heart. And so the worst punishment that can afflict a person in this dunya, it's not loss of wealth, it's not loss of health, it's not loss of children, and all of it's loss of the softness of heart. It's the blindness and the hardening of the heart. And so that is the consequence of sin. And the Prophet ﷺ told us about this. If you sin, what happens? The sin is enveloped in what? In a darkness until the heart is enveloped in a darkness until the heart becomes like a utensil which is upside down, a vessel which is upside down. No matter how much water you pour into it, it's not going to keep anything. Like cemented floor, the rain falls and falls and falls, but what happens? The water collects above the ground, the soil beneath the cement, but the water collects above the ground and nothing can grow. And likewise, the hardened heart. And so the worst affliction that a person can suffer is the hardening of the heart. And the person who has an understanding, who has knowledge, ma'rifah, knowledge of Allah's qudrah and Allah's reign, that's the person who develops the opposite, which is what? Awe and hayba, awe and khawf, so awe and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. Those who actually have khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so awe and fear from the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are who? Al-ulama. Those who actually fear Him are the ulama. Why? Because they have ma'rifah of Allah's qudrah, of Allah's ability. They have ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's reign, dominion, domain. And if a person is seeking knowledge and they're not increasing in khawf and khashya and khushu', then there's something wrong with the way he's seeking knowledge. perhaps even something wrong with the knowledge he's seeking. And a person can seek knowledge in the wrong way, and it's not helpful. So then he says, وَنُفُوذِ مَشِيئَتِهِ فِي. Likewise, like the ma'rifah of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mashi'ah, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills and wants, takes place. There's nothing, there's la radda lahu. No one can stop the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from taking place. And everything takes place bi mashi'atihi. And in this issue here, if a person understands the concept of mashi'atullah, like that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a will and nothing takes place in this dunya unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala determines and allows it to take place, there's an alleviation from some of the mental health issues that people are suffering today. And that's why I think a more befitting term to use rather than mental health is spiritual health. Why? Because anxiety, depression, a lot of these things are related to a lack of understanding of the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person who knows that his provision is maqdur, has been written for him prior to him even coming into this life, he's not going to find the same kind of pain and suffering that people find in a lack of wealth today, in a lack of health today, etc. And you see it, subhanAllah, sometimes when you're sick or when a person is sick and they're a believer, sometimes the sickness is like a mirror that Allah places in front of the person to let them know that there's some iman there. Because you see the iman come out when they start to find tranquility and solace in knowing that it's from Allah. This affliction is from Allah. And it gives them peace of mind. It gives them patience and so on and so forth. So then he says, وَأَنَّهُ he says, مَعَ قِلَّةِ الْمُبَالَاةِ بِهِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his mashi'ah, that which Allah decrees takes place. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, مَعَ قِلَّةِ الْمُبَالَاةِ فِيهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have concern for the creation in the sense that he says, أَنَّهُ لَوْ أَهْلَكَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَالْآخَرِينَ لَمْ يَنْقُصْ مِنْ مُلْكِهِ ذَرَّةً. That if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to destroy the first and the last of his creation, it wouldn't take away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way. It wouldn't harm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any way. It's not like us, for example. If you spent your entire life building something and you see it destroyed right in front of you, it can destroy you internally. And when your child passes away, it hurts your heart, etc. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though we are his creation, there's no concern of that nature for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like we are not, there's no, what's the word? A word which is often used in the West, unfortunately today. We have no privilege over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no entitlement that we have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah doesn't need to give us anything. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need our existence. And this is important to know because sometimes people worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then they assume, now that I'm worshipping Allah, things should be going well for me. And you even hear people asking, I don't understand. I'm praying 5 times a day. I'm fasting. I'm giving zakah. I'm staying away from the haram. I'm doing halal. So why am I still being afflicted? Why am I still being tested? Because they expect that now that they're doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked them to do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in exchange should make their life easy for them, make their life comfortable for them. And if they were to only reflect over the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the best of creation, the Sayyidul Anbiya, the master of prophets and man, if they were to reflect over his life, he was the best of worshippers. He had the best of missions. He carried it out to the best of degrees, but yet he was the most tested. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need to respond to our worship in any way. We have no favor over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have no privilege over to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as in Allah doesn't owe us anything, nor are we entitled to anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when you understand that, I am not entitled to anything, and Allah is all capable, Allah is all knowing, whatever Allah decrees is going to happen, automatically what should be born from knowing that? What should happen in your heart? What should you feel? Yeah, but also fear. Fear. There should be fear. Why? Because you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not far from you. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الرَّجَاء. So the opposite is what? الرجاء. But he says anyway, وَبِالْجُمْلَةِ كُلَّمَا زَادَ الْعِلْمَ بِاللَّهِ زَادَتِ الْخَشْيَةَ وَالْهَيْبَةِ. The more that a person increases in his or her knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the hayba and the khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase in that person's heart. And so the opposite can be also said. The less you know of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the less khashya and hayba you will have in your heart. And likewise, if you are studying and you're finding that there's no increase in khashya and hayba, you're not studying right. And it's a conundrum of our time. Why? Because people study the theory. They study the theory, especially when it comes to aqeedah. They study the theory of Allah's names, the theory of Allah's attributes, and they have no connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names and attributes in their life. They're studying, they start off for the wrong reason. I want to study aqeedah so I can refute the people of bid'ah and the people of shirk and the people of kufr and so on and so forth. That's not why we learn the deen. We don't learn the deen in response to others. We learn the deen for ourselves. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, I'm not going to be questioned about the actions and the beliefs of others unless I'm questioned about myself first. Yeah, myself, then my family, and then others. And so we find today people study aqeedah, but yet it doesn't increase them in khashya and hayba because they're studying it the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. Aqeedah, the study of aqeedah is to study Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, develop a relationship with Him in your life. Nothing else. It's not for arguing and looking like a theologian and so on and so forth. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الرَّجَاء فَسَبَبُهُ مَعْرِفَةُ لُطْفِ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ وَكَرَمِهِ وَعَمِيمِ إِنْعَامِهِ وَمَعْرِفَةُ صِدْقِهِ فِي وَعْدِهِ الْجَنَّةَ بِالصَّلَاةِ إذا حصل اليقين بوعده والمعرفة بلطفه انبعث من مجموعها الرجاء لا محالة. So he says that الرجاء, so hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it comes from knowing the lutf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing the mercy, and I use these terms loosely. Why? Because words have meanings and meanings have connotations and so on and so forth. And so, it's to the best of my ability, so loosely, but, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's kindness, His compassion, the love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for His slaves and like the lutf, you could describe a lady, a woman as latifa when she's soft and kind, and she's caring and concerned for her child. You say that she's latifa. She's a very concerned and caring, loving mother. Likewise, you can say هذا رجل لطيف, like when he's like very concerning and so on and so forth, or concerned, etc. for another. So like the lutf comes from that kind of meaning. And he says وَعَمِيمِ إِنْعَامِهِ, likewise the abundant favor and gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to His servants and His slaves. And you only have to sit for a few seconds and think about yourself, and the journey begins. Your sight, your lungs, your capacity to think, your capacity to feel, your ability to purchase with the wealth that Allah has given you, the muscles that you're using, your parents, your spouse if you have one, your children if you have children, your ability to have a spouse, all of these things. The more you think, the more you'll find. The more you think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah and His lutf, the more you will find. And he says when a person thinks in that manner, and then he thinks about the truthfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promises. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no Muslim that would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not truthful in His promises. And so when you read through Jannah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has given a wa'ad, a promise of Jannah for who? The people of prayer. And He has also given a promise of consequence for those that do not pray, and so on and so forth. But knowing this, what happens? Raja is born from the heart. So the hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, hope in His compassion, hope in His generosity is born from contemplating and reflecting over all of these things. And so what we can see, before we continue, what we can see is the journey to concentrating in salah starts before the salah. The journey in concentrating in the salah starts before the salah. It starts with reflecting. It starts with the way that we live our lives. If you are not living Islam outside of the prayer, it's going to be very difficult to have a salah that is alive. It's going to be very difficult to have a meaningful prayer. If you're not reflective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life, it's going to be very difficult to be reflective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the salah. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الْحَيَاء. So I guess shyness, to be shy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, فَسَبَبُهُ مَعْرِفَةُ لُطْفِ اللَّهِ. No, sorry, I went back up. He says, وَأَمَّا الْحَيَاء فَبِاسْتِشْعَارِهِ التَّقْصِيرَ فِي الْعِبَادَةِ. So a person will develop a feeling of shyness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being able to feel or be aware of his deficiencies in worship. His deficiencies. Why? Because you know how great Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and you know how deficient your salah is. You know how deficient your siyam is. You know how deficient your zakat, if you're able to give zakat, is. You know how deficient you are in fulfilling the potential that Allah has given you. And so all of this leads to you feeling what? Shy to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As if I don't deserve to stand in front of you. I don't deserve to ask from you because of everything that you've given me. He says, وَعِلْمِهِ بِالْعَجْزِ عَنِ الْقِيَامِ بِعَظِيمِ حَقِّ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. And by realizing his lack of ability in being able to fulfill the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon him. So if we were to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala day and night, non-stop, we wouldn't be able to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the right that he has over us. And so knowing that, feeling that, just by the fact that Allah has created us, we're already unable to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his right. There's nothing we can do to give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the right that he has over us. And then if you think, especially for those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed with, the ability to practice Islam to a degree. And then above that, those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the ability to study. And then above that, those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the ability to worship. All of it comes from who? From Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives you the tawfiq. Allah grants you the success in being able to worship. So how is it possible that you can thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through worship if he's the one that gives you the success in being able to worship in the first place? It's impossible. And so when a person realizes that, what happens? He becomes shy. He becomes shy in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, وَيُقَوِّي ذَلِكَ بِالْمَعْرِفَةِ بِعُيُوبِ النَّفْسِ وَآفَاتِهَا. And he strengthens this feeling of shyness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by remembering not only his deficiencies in worship and so on and so forth, but also by remembering or by realizing the deficiencies he has in his self, his sins, his mistakes, his the low whims and desires that he has that are contained within him. And he says, وَقِلَّةِ إِخْلَاصِهَا, i.e. the nafs. Likewise, by recognizing the lack of ikhlas that his nafs has. So the nafs, it's very difficult to have ikhlas. And some of the ulama, they say, al-ikhlas ay yu'afik Allah. Why? Because one of the earlier scholars of Islam, he said, فِعْلُ الشَّيْء لِلنَّاسِ رِيَاء وَتَرْكُ الشَّيْء لِلنَّاسِ رِيَاء. He said, like, if you do something for the people, you're showing off. And if you leave something off for the people, you're showing off. So what do you do then? The response is, al-ikhlas ay yu'afik Allah. That ikhlas is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you the ability to have ikhlas. And so when you realize that it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how difficult it is to attain ikhlas, you'll start to realize how little ikhlas you actually have. Some of the earlier scholars of Islam, they considered any action that they did in public to be devoid of ikhlas in the first place. They wouldn't even consider those actions as being for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of the risk that they felt was present from acting for the sake of other people, etc., not acting for Allah. So he says, if you recognize like paired with your recognition of your deficiency in worship, etc., and you recognize at the same time the mistakes that you have in yourself and the lack of ikhlas that you have, and then he says, مع العلم بعظيم ما يقتضيه جلال الله عز وجل والعلم بأنه مطلع على السر وخطرات القلب وإن دقت وخفيت. And add to that you realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of all things, including the inner thoughts and whispers that you have inside you that no one else is aware of. So those inner thoughts and whispers that you have that you would feel ashamed for other people to hear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows them. And so when you add all of this together and you stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are you going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala feeling like you're righteous? Only a fool would stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala feeling like he or she is a righteous person. If they are aware of the deficiencies they have in worship, they're aware of the uyub that they have in their self, the blemishes of the nafs that they have, and they're aware of the fact that Allah knows all of the inner secrets, all of the inner thoughts, all of the inner mistakes, and no man is free of them. No man is free of them. That person is not going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if they're righteous. They're going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they're going to have what? Haya. They're going to feel ashamed. They're going to feel ashamed to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, embarrassed. Just like a person who doesn't feel that they are fit to stand in front of a king would stand in front of a king. They don't feel that they deserve to stand in front of the king. Then he says, وَهَذِهِ الْمَعَارِفُ إِذَا حَصَلَتْ يَقِينًا انبعثت منها بالضرورة حالة تسمى الحياة. So as we just said, if all of these things come together and it's with certainty, like the person acquires certain knowledge of all of these things, then what is born from that compilation of understanding? Haya. And here the issue of uyub is something that we have to consider in our time today, because unfortunately there are many individuals, they've taken it upon themselves to not only notice and look for, but to bring to the attention of others the mistakes of others. And that's a marad, it's a sickness. It's a sickness. Al-Ajurri, what did he say? شَغَلَتْنِي عُيُوبِي عَنْ عُيُوبِ النَّاسِ. He said that my own deficiencies, my own mistakes have busied me from noticing the mistakes and the deficiencies of others. But yet today, we have some individuals, unfortunately, they see themselves as the protectors of Islam, and they assume that their position within this ummah is to constantly be critical of others, pull out all of the mistakes of others, clarify to others how others are mistaken, and so on and so forth. And the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet said in a hadith which is weakly attributed to him, but the ulama say the meaning is correct, كَمَا تُدِينُ تُدَانُ. As you treat others, you will be treated. As you treat others, you will be treated. And there's a saying, the person basically made the bow that was used to strike him. You made the bow and you made the arrow. Someone else is simply using it against you. If your sole existence and the worth that you have, that you contribute to this ummah, is to criticize and point out the mistakes of others, then you have really misunderstood the deen. You have really misunderstood Islam. And to sit and read the Quran and to engage in dhikr and to learn the Arabic language is far more beneficial than wasting your time looking at the mistakes of others. Because on Yawm al-Qiyamah, I'm not going to be questioned about the mistakes of others. You're not going to be questioned about the mistakes of others. We're going to be questioned about ourselves, about our families. And if a person feels that they have rectified their own mistakes to a degree that they can now start busying themselves with the mistakes of others, this person is blind. And the worst person is a person who is blind to their own mistakes, but recognizes the mistakes of others. And this is what social media does as well. There are some individuals, their self-worth comes from the relevance that they have online. And the best way to acquire relevance online is to attack others and to criticize others, especially if the other people that you're attacking and criticizing are famous. It's very easy. Anyone can do it, but it's not sincere. And it's not contributing any benefit to the ummah. And what's unfortunate is that these individuals, they will complain about the state of the ummah. They will complain about the state of the ummah whilst not recognizing that they are a contributing factor in the situation that the ummah currently faces. They're a contributing factor in the problems that we have within our ummah. When you have an ummah which is divided, an ummah which is fighting itself, how is it that ummah possibly going to establish anything? It's very difficult. And if you look, subhanAllah, we build only for other hands from within our community to tear down. And that's not what Islam is about. The Prophet ﷺ, if we read the seerah, the Prophet ﷺ, he knew who the munafiqun were. Who are the munafiqun? The munafiqun, the hypocrites, they are not Muslims. I'm talking about munafiqun of the heart, not munafiqun in action. The munafiqun, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they were not Muslims. They were not Muslims. They were individuals who wore the clothing of Islam only to hide the disbelief in their hearts. The Prophet ﷺ knew who these individuals were. And some of the Sahaba asked the Prophet ﷺ, shall we deal with them? The Prophet ﷺ said, no. Why? He said, because I do not want it to be said that the Prophet Muhammad is taking out members of his own community. These are munafiqun. They are trying to destroy Islam from the inside out. But the Prophet ﷺ, he did not deal with them publicly. Number one. Number two, the Prophet ﷺ would treat them as he would treat other Muslims. He would treat them as he would treat other Muslims. And the ulama, they say that if there is a munafiq, the munafiq should be treated in accordance to that which he shows. Because only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the heart. And today you have individuals who, by all of their actions, we assume them to be Muslims, and not only Muslims, but Muslims who are dedicated to Islam. Yes, they are going to have mistakes because every man has mistakes. And you have individuals that will constantly criticize and pull down and attack and so on and so forth. And the easiest thing to do is to criticize the actions of others whilst you yourself do not try to achieve what they've done, but correctly. If what they're doing is so bad, stand up and do what they're doing, but do a better job. And you won't find these people doing this. Why? Because it's easy to sit and refute. It's easy to pull out pictures and pull out quotes, and anyone can do that, especially with the internet. Now with AI, you can probably program a bot to do it for you. But to stand up and do what these people have done, but do it better than them, that's what separates people of real concern and people that are searching for a quick minute of fame. And Allah knows best. And these individuals, they're armchair critics. And the best way to look at it is look at those who are critical of sports personalities. You have a man who cannot run a mile. I'm sorry for saying it like this, but overweight, probably hasn't played sports for the last 10 years of his life. And yet he'll be shouting at an athlete on TV, how can he miss that? How can he not do this? How can he not do that? How did he, do this and do that? Or someone who doesn't know how to box, watching a boxer and saying, this boxer is terrible. He can't box. Can you box? It's easy to sit and have an opinion, but it's very difficult to get into the arena and to do it properly. And these individuals, they are destroying our communities. Destroying our communities. The Prophet ﷺ, he focused on what? Ta'sis. He focused on the ta'sis, the building, the establishing, before he focused on other things. And you cannot focus on the roof if you don't have a foundation to build your house. There's no foundation, let alone a house. And you're talking about issues that are related to a roof. It's a lack of hikmah. And the ulama, they say, al-alim al-rabbani, the alim who is a rabbani meaning the nurturing scholar, is the one who teaches sagarul ilm qabla kibarihi. He teaches the small issues of knowledge before the big issues. He lays the bricks before he makes the wall. Because in laying the bricks, you develop the wall. And a person who's foolish will be talking about a wall and he doesn't even know how to lay the bricks. And that's what the online world is. And so we have to be very careful, and we shouldn't accept this type of behavior. And for those that are studying, they should keep themselves away from any of that. If you're studying, then you should not be involved in debating and so on and so forth. Then he says, فهذه أسباب وهذه الصفات وكل ما طلب تحصيله فعلاجه إحضار سببه ففي معرفة السبب معرفة العلاج ورابطة جميع هذه الأسباب الإيمان. So he says, these are the means of acquiring the qualities that were mentioned, i.e. the 6 qualities that lead to a living prayer. And in order to acquire the quality he says, where did it go? I just skipped a page for some reason. He says, وَكُلُّ مَا طُلِبَ تَحْصِيلُهُ فَعِلَاجُهُ إِحْضَارُ سَبِّبِهِ. Everything that you're trying to acquire, the way to acquire it is basically to acquire its means or its cure. Like if the sickness is what? A lack of presence in the salah. So the way to acquire presence in the salah is to acquire the cure for a lack of presence in the salah, and so on and so forth. And then he says, فَفِي مَعْرِفَةِ السَّبَبِ مَعْرِفَةُ الْعِلَاجِ. And how do you acquire the ilaj, the cure? It's by knowing the reason for the sickness. And that's, it's a general statement. And this is one of the problems of modern times. Modern times, if you look at, for example, modern medicine, and of course, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to speak about, medicines specifically, but if you look at, for example, a person has diabetes, a person develops high blood pressure, all of these things, the way that we treat these things is with medicine rather than looking at the cause, generally speaking. Nowadays, we talk about the cause, etc. But the cause of the overeating, the cause of the overdrinking, the cause of all of these issues, it's not the availability of food, it's the philosophy that leads a person to over-consuming. It's the consumerism, it's the capitalism. But we don't talk about these causes. We talk about a person should control the nafs. A person should, control themselves. But we don't talk about why a person has no ability to control themselves. How can a young man control himself when society is telling him not to control himself in every way? Every angle a young man turns to, society is pushing him. Don't control yourself. Society is pushing him towards materialism and so on and so forth, carving his insides out so he becomes a soulless casket. And then we tell him, control yourself. No, you have to talk about the reason for the young man being unable to control himself. You have to look at the underlying cause. And then he says, وَرَابِطَةُ جَمِيعِ هَذِهِ الْأَسْبَابِ الْإِيمَانِ. So the that which brings all of these things together is what? Iman. So all of these things are brought together by Iman. The common theme within all of these things, Iman. Then he says, وَبِاخْتِلَافِ الْمَعَانِيَ الَّتِي ذَكَرْنَاهَا انقسم الناس إلى عاقل يتمم صلاته ولم يحضر قلبه في لحظة منها وإلى من يتمم ولم يغب قلبه في لحظة ولكل درجات مما عملوا. So he says that in accordance to these ma'ani, these means, people are divided into different categories. From them, those who complete the prayer in the actions, external actions, but the heart is not present for a moment of the prayer. And that's those who concentrate on fiqh alone. The ulama, they say, al-fiqh yuqassi al-qalb. That fiqh, solely focusing on the fiqh and the rulings, on the framework of law in Islam, will lead to a heart which is hardened. Why? Because it becomes like reading a manual in engineering. It's how the engineer develops the prayer and so on and so forth. And so if a person is only studying fiqh without studying Iman, without reading about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without reading about that which relates to the akhirah, without trying to reflect over his own illnesses and sicknesses of the heart, etc., then it's very easy for him to pray, and his prayer is perfect. A faqih will say this is a person who knows how to pray, but the inside is lacking. The heart's not there. He says, وَإِلَى مَنْ يُتَمِّمْ وَلَمْ يَغِبْ قَلْبُهُ فِي لَحْظَةٍ. And the other category of people are those who complete the prayer and the heart is present for the duration of the prayer. And then he mentions the ayah, وَلِكُلٍّ دَرَجَاتٌ مِمَّا عَمِلُوا. And for every person, they will basically have that which they do. Their levels will be in accordance to the amount of action. But he's saying the action is not only external, it's also internal. And the most important part is the internal. He says, فَحَظُّ كُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّن صَلَاتِهِ بِقَدْرِ خَوْفِهِ وَخُشُوعِهِ وَتَعْظِيمِهِ فَإِنَّ مَوْقِعَ نَظَرِ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ الْقُلُوبِ دُونَ ظَاهِرِ الْحَرَكَاتِ. So he says for every person they'll have a share of the reward in accordance to the presence of fear, of concentration, of focus, of glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what determines how much a person will have in the salah of reward. It's not, how did a person raise their hands? It's not where the person places the hands in salah. It's not the method of prayer. And you find young brothers or young students of knowledge, they focus on these things. Oh, the sunnah in salah is what? To raise the hands. The sunnah in salah is not to raise the hands. The sunnah in salah is to pray like this. The sunnah in salah is to put your feet next to my feet. No, it's not, and so on and so forth. That's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards a person for. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards a person for the presence of the heart in salah. That's the most important thing. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at the hearts, not at the external actions. Not at the external actions. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لَيْسَ الْبِرُّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ, that piety is not for you to face the east or the west. That's not what piety is. وَلَكِنَّ الْبِرَّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. Like that, really, piety is to what? To believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to believe in the last day, to believe in the angels, to give from what you have in times of difficulty, in times of ease, to feed the poor. And those actions come from the heart, the giving, the belief, the iman, the patience in times of darra and sarra, ease and difficulty, and so on and so forth. And so he's saying the place of concentration in the prayer should be what? The heart. Should be the heart. And when we study fiqh in order to know how to pray, and that's where it stops initially. And then we should be focusing on the presence of the heart in the salah. It shouldn't be I'm studying fiqh so that I can know the truth of the sunnah in these issues. You can't arrive at the truth when it comes to the sunnah until you reach the high level of knowledge. And even then, it's perspective. It's going to be your perspective. It's going to be your opinion. And that's going to be influenced by your social circumstances, by the amount of knowledge that you have acquired, by your capacity to think, by your inclinations into certain things, and so on and so forth. But that which is most important is the presence of the heart, iman. And we'll conclude with that, inshallah. He says, الدواء النافع في حضور القلب. Now he's going to speak about beneficial cures, like that which leads to basically having a present heart. So we'll continue with that, inshallah, next week. Any questions? No questions or disagreements? No? Khalas, we'll conclude then, and we'll continue next week, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.